Giuseppe doesn't know the word genome. He doesn't need to. He's a shepherd and a grandfather, and right now he's bouncing across a scrub-covered hillside in the Ogliastra highlands of eastern Sardinia, one hand on the throttle of a battered Honda ATV, the other holding a phone he uses to video call his daughter who studies economics in Milan. The morning light is honey-colored and hard, the kind of light that makes the limestone outcrops glow white against the green. And about 300 meters below him, the Tyrrhenian Sea is a flat blue plate stretching all the way to the horizon. He stops the ATV, kills the engine, and lets the silence rush in. Sheep bells clank somewhere uphill. A dog barks twice and goes quiet. He checks the phone. His daughter sent him a heart emoji and a picture of her cappuccino. He smiles, pockets the phone, and swings his leg off the ATV to go check the water trough. Now hold that image. The ATV, the iPhone, the daughter in Milan. The shepherd doing what shepherds on this island have done for 4,000 years. Comfortable, modern, nothing extraordinary. Except for this. In every single nucleated cell in Giuseppe's body, in the white blood cells coursing through his hand as he reaches for the trough valve, there sits a genome that is older than every other European genome on Earth. Not old in some vague poetic sense. Quantifiably, measurably older. When geneticists ran the numbers, they found that the genetic distance between Giuseppe and a person who died on this island 40 centuries ago is so small it barely registers on their charts. And when they sequenced a frozen corpse pulled from a glacier in the Alps, a man who died 5,300 years ago in what is now Austria, they discovered something that made them check their equipment 3 times. That Iceman's closest living relatives on planet Earth are not the Austrians. They are not the northern Italians. They are Giuseppe. They are the 1.6 million people living on this 24,000 square kilometer island, 800 miles southwest of where that body fell. Sardinia is a time capsule stitched into the Mediterranean, and the people who live there are walking around with a version of Europe's past that got erased everywhere else. Scientists just proved it, not theorized, not speculated, proved, in a sequence of landmark studies published across Nature Genetics, Nature Communications, PLOS Genetics, and Nature. Each one stacking on the last until the picture became undeniable. Modern Sardinian DNA is older than every other European DNA. By thousands of years. Think about what that means. We tend to imagine human history as a smooth blend. Populations mixing and flowing across borders. Everyone a little bit of everything. And for most of Europe, that's actually true. Walk through London, through Berlin, through Madrid, and the faces you see are the product of multiple massive population turnovers. Waves of migration that crashed across the continent and rewrote the genetic map each time. But not Sardinia. Sardinia got skipped by the biggest population rewrite in European history. It's as if someone hit pause on a VHS tape at the end of the Stone Age, and the rest of Europe kept playing for 5,000 years. And when you look at the screen showing Sardinia, the image is still the same frame. That's not a metaphor. That's what the DNA shows. Picture it. Picture the European continent around 7000 BCE. Small bands of farmers are crossing from Anatolia, carrying seeds, carrying livestock, carrying a whole new way of being human. They spread west and north, generation by generation, mixing with the hunter-gatherers they meet, settling river valleys, clearing forests, building the first permanent villages. These people, whom geneticists call early European farmers, or EEF, become the dominant population across Europe for thousands of years. They build Stonehenge. They build the great megalithic tombs. They shape the landscape in ways we can still see. And then, around 2500 BCE, something immense happens. A new population explodes out of the Pontic steppe, the grasslands north of the Black Sea. These are the Yamnaya people, pastoralists, horse riders, wagon builders, carriers of a new technology and a new social structure and a new language family that will eventually become almost every language spoken in Europe today. They sweep west in wave after wave, and where they go, the genetic signature of the early European farmers gets erased. Not completely, but drastically. Modern Northern Europeans carry roughly 30 to 50% steppe ancestry. The Irish carry 40 to 50%. The genetic impact of that Bronze Age migration is so profound that when geneticists sequence ancient skeletons from before the steppe arrival and compare them to modern people in the same regions, the dots on their charts fly apart. A modern Englishman is genetically a very different creature from the people who built Stonehenge. The population was replaced, transformed, overwritten. But Sardinia didn't get that transformation. Sardinia is an island, and the sea that surrounds it acted as a wall. The steppe migration that rewrote the genetics of mainland Europe from Portugal to Poland, from Scotland to Sicily, barely touched this one island. Modern Sardinians carry only approximately 10 to 15% steppe ancestry. That's the lowest in Europe by a wide margin. The rest of their genome, something like 60 to 70%, is early European farmer ancestry. That's the highest EEF percentage of any modern European population. When you look at a Sardinian, you are looking at a face whose basic genetic architecture was set in place thousands of years before the Bronze Age, and has drifted remarkably little since. You are looking at a living, breathing echo of Neolithic Europe. Now I want you to hold that number in your head. 60 to 70% early European farmer. And then I want you to think about Ötzi. Ötzi the Iceman is one of the most famous archaeological discoveries in history. Two German hikers found him in September 1991, emerging from the melting ice of the Ötztal Alps on the border between Austria and Italy. At first, the authorities thought he was a modern mountaineer who had died in some recent accident. They tried to free his body with a jackhammer. When they realized what they were actually dealing with, a man who had died around 3300 BCE, roughly 5,300 years ago, it changed the study of prehistory overnight. Here was a Copper Age man, preserved in astonishing detail, with his clothing, his equipment, his last meals still in his stomach, his tattoos still visible on his skin. He became a global icon. Books were written, documentaries filmed, museum exhibits constructed. Everyone assumed that Ötzi was an ancestor of the modern Alpine populations who live where he died. The Austrians and northern Italians who gaze up at those same peaks, who speak German and Italian and Latin, who drink their espresso and ski their slopes, surely they carry his blood in their veins. That assumption held until 2012, when a team led by Andreas Keller published the full genome sequence of Ötzi in Nature Communications. The paper was titled, with typical scientific understatement, New Insights into the Tyrolean Iceman's Origin and Phenotype as Inferred by Whole Genome Sequencing. But the insight was a bombshell. When Keller's team compared Ötzi's genome to a large panel of modern European populations, they found that his closest living genetic relatives were not the Austrians. They were not the Italians of the Alpine valleys. They were the people of Sardinia. Ötzi, a man who died in the Alps, who lived his entire life among the peaks and valleys of Central Europe, was genetically more similar to the modern inhabitants of a Mediterranean island 800 miles away than he was to the people living in the very mountains where his body fell. Let that settle. The ice melts back. The body emerges. The scientists run their sequencers, and the computer points not north, not east, but south, across the sea, to an island the Iceman almost certainly never saw and never knew existed. As a 2014 follow-up study by Sikora and colleagues in PLOS Genetics confirmed with an even larger reference panel, Ötzi and Sardinians share a common ancestral population that was once widespread across Europe and has since been diluted and displaced by subsequent migrations everywhere except on that one island. Ötzi is not an Alpine ancestor preserved on ice. Ötzi is a Sardinian ancestor preserved on ice. Sardinia didn't move to Ötzi. Ötzi's true genetic kin moved to Sardinia, or more accurately, stayed on Sardinia while their mainland cousins vanished. Now let's go deeper, into the specific mechanism of that vanishing and that staying. You need to understand what happened on Sardinia while the rest of Europe was being transformed. And you need to understand the Nuragic civilization. Around 1800 BCE, while the steppe migrations were still rippling through the continent, the people of Sardinia began building something utterly unique in the ancient world. They erected massive stone towers called nuragi. You've probably never seen one, so let me describe it. A nurag is a truncated cone of enormous basalt or granite blocks, dry stacked without mortar, rising several stories high, with corbel-vaulted interior chambers connected by steep staircases cut into the thickness of the walls. Some are single towers. Others are elaborate complexes with multiple towers linked by curtain walls, courtyards, wells, and underground storage rooms. And they built these things everywhere. Approximately 7,000 nuragi still dot the Sardinian landscape, so many that in some areas you can stand on one and see 2 or 3 others silhouetted on the next ridges. Sardinia is thick with them, a forest of stone that has stood for nearly 4,000 years. For a long time, archaeologists could describe the nuragi and the bronze figurines and the intricate stone carvings, but they couldn't answer the most basic question: Who were the Nuragic people genetically? Were they the same population as modern Sardinians? Or were they some lost civilization, replaced by later arrivals? The answer came in 2020, when a team led by Joseph Marcus published a study in Nature Communications that is, for my money, one of the most important papers in European population genetics of the last decade. Marcus and his colleagues sequenced the genomes of 70 ancient Sardinians, spanning a timeline from the Middle Neolithic, roughly 4,100 years ago, through the Nuragic Bronze Age and into the Roman period. And then they did the thing that makes population geneticists' hearts beat faster. They laid those ancient genomes on a PCA plot, a principal component analysis chart that arranges genetic data so that similar populations cluster together and different populations fly apart. And then they overlaid the genomes of modern Sardinians on the same chart. What happened next is the intellectual equivalent of a thunderclap. The dots almost perfectly overlapped. The ancient Sardinians from 41 centuries ago, and the Nuragic Sardinians from the Bronze Age, and the modern Sardinians swabbing their cheeks in a 21st century lab, all clustered together in a tight, unmistakable group. The genetic distance between a modern Sardinian and a Nuragic Sardinian who lived 3,500 years ago is almost zero. These are essentially the same people. The Nuragic civilization didn't collapse and get replaced. The people endured. The language endured. The genome endured. Contrast that with what we see everywhere else in Europe. When geneticists sequence a Bronze Age Briton and compare him to a modern Briton, they see a dramatic genetic shift. The steppe migration replaced roughly 90% of the British gene pool. A modern Englishman's genome has very little in common with the people who built Stonehenge. The same is true in Iberia, in Central Europe, in Scandinavia. Everywhere the story is one of turnover, replacement, transformation. Everywhere except Sardinia. The Marcus paper showed, in hard quantitative terms, that Sardinia is a genetic isolate of extraordinary depth and fidelity. The ancestral genetic signal has been preserved with what the Chiang 2018 study in Nature Genetics, which sequenced the genomes of over 3,500 modern Sardinians, explicitly called unusual fidelity. That's a phrase from a Nature paper. Unusual fidelity. Sardinia, that paper declared, is a unique laboratory for understanding the Neolithic transition. The people living there today carry a version of the European genome that on the mainland was overwritten 5,000 years ago. They are not relics in a derogatory sense. They are a living reference library of what Europe used to be. Now let me give you a specific genetic marker, something you can hang this whole story on. You've probably heard of Y-DNA haplogroups, those paternal lineages passed from father to son across generations. Europe today is dominated by a few major haplogroups, chief among them R1b, which came in with the steppe migration and now sits at high frequency across Western Europe. In Ireland, R1b can reach 80% or more. In mainland Italy, it's common. But in Sardinia, something else dominates. Something older. Haplogroup I2A1A-M26. This lineage is a pre-Neolithic European marker, meaning it traces back to the hunter-gatherers who lived in Europe before the farmers arrived from Anatolia. It is a deep, ancient European paternal line. And almost everywhere else in Europe, it has been marginalized to below 5%. Often much less. The waves of farmers and then steppe pastoralists swamped it. But in Sardinia, I2A1A6 is present at an astonishing 35 to 40% frequency. Let me say that again. A Y-DNA lineage that is a ghost elsewhere in Europe, a remnant at best, is the single most common paternal line among Sardinian men. That's not a minor statistical blip. That's a pre-Neolithic European population surviving into the smartphone era at frequencies that haven't been seen on the mainland since before the first seed was planted. And it's not just I2A1A. Sardinians also carry high frequencies of haplogroup G2A, a classic Neolithic farmer lineage brought by those Anatolian migrants 7,000 years ago. The mitochondrial DNA, the maternal lines passed from mother to child, tell the same story. The mtDNA haplogroups H, U, K, J, and T form a deep European farmer maternal pool with substantial pre-Neolithic hunter-gatherer contributions. When you look at Sardinian DNA from every angle, paternal and maternal, ancient and modern, the signal is consistent. This is a population that has absorbed some outside gene flow, yes. The Phoenicians arrived around 800 BCE, establishing trading colonies along the coast. The Romans conquered the island in 238 BCE. The Vandals swept through in 456 CE. And later, Pisans and Genoese and Spanish ruled various parts of the island. None of these produced a major genetic replacement. The admixture is minor, concentrated along the coastal zones, and has barely penetrated the mountainous interior where communities like Giuseppe's have lived for millennia. The Nuragic genome, the Neolithic farmer genome, the pre-steppe European genome, whatever you want to call it, survived. It sits in the bones and the blood and the cheek swabs of modern Sardinians, as legible as a text written in stone. Now let's take a hard turn, because this story gets even stranger, and it goes straight to the question of human lifespan. Sardinia is not just a genetic time capsule. It is also one of the only places on Earth where people routinely live past 100 in numbers, that defy global demographic patterns. And the specific nature of that longevity, the who and the how of it, is so unusual that it may be linked directly to the genetic isolation we've been discussing. Dan Buettner, a National Geographic Fellow, identified 5 blue zones around the world in the early 2000s. These are regions with an unusually high concentration of centenarians, people who live to 100 and beyond. Okinawa in Japan, Ikaria in Greece, the Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica, Loma Linda in California, and the province of Ogliastra in eastern Sardinia. Ogliastra is the mountainous region where Giuseppe tends his sheep. It is a landscape of steep valleys, isolated villages, and deep tradition, and it produces centenarians at a rate that demographers have struggled to explain. But here is the detail that stops researchers in their tracks. Globally, centenarians are overwhelmingly female. The numbers are stark. For every 100 centenarians worldwide, roughly 80 are women. The sex ratio is dramatically skewed. Women, for reasons both genetic and environmental, tend to outlive men almost everywhere, except in Ogliastra. In Sardinia's blue zone, the male-to-female centenarian ratio approaches 1:1. Men are living to 100 at rates that are essentially equal to women. That should not happen. There is no other population on the planet where male longevity closes the gap so dramatically at the extreme upper end of the lifespan distribution. Something is different in these mountain villages. Something is buffering these men against the mortality that cuts down their counterparts everywhere else on Earth. Researchers have proposed many explanations. The traditional Sardinian diet, rich in whole grains, sheep's milk cheese, wild greens, and moderate red wine. The steep terrain that forces daily low-intensity physical activity well into old age. The strong family structures and social integration. All of these matter. But increasingly, geneticists are looking at the possibility that isolation has played a role. When a population remains relatively closed for thousands of years, certain genetic variants can rise to high frequency. Some of those variants may affect longevity. Sazzini and colleagues published a 2016 paper on the genetic architecture of longevity in Sardinian isolates, and while they didn't point to a single magical centenarian gene, they documented a complex interplay of genetic factors that, in this unique genetic background, may be combining with the environment to push lifespan outward. It's not that Sardinians have a longevity gene nobody else has. It's that the entire genomic background, the same background that preserves the Neolithic signal, may be interacting with specific genetic variants in ways that can't happen in more admixed populations. The time capsule may not just preserve old bones and old languages. It may preserve patterns of health and aging that the rest of Europe lost when the steppe migration rewrote the genome. Now, let's address something obvious. Sardinia is part of Italy. It has been politically Italian since 1861. Sardinians speak Italian, pay taxes to Rome, cheer for the national football team. Does that mean they are genetically Italian? No. And this is one of the hardest things for people to wrap their heads around, because we are culturally conditioned to conflate political borders with genetic relationships. But DNA does not care about flags. DNA does not care about nation-states. And when you plot European genetic variation on a chart, Sardinians do something almost no other population does. They fly off by themselves. The famous 2008 Nature paper by Novembre and colleagues, Genes Mirror Geography Within Europe, produced one of the most iconic images in modern genetics. It was a principal component analysis plot of European genetic variation, and when the researchers overlaid the genetic data on a map of Europe, the correspondence was stunning. The genetic relationships between populations almost perfectly recapitulated the geographic relationships. French people clustered near French people, Germans near Germans. The genetic map was a near-perfect mirror of the physical map, but there was one glaring exception: Sardinia. Sardinians didn't cluster anywhere near their Italian compatriots. They sat off in their own space, distinct, separate, closer in genetic distance to Ötzi, a Bronze Age alpine man, than to the modern inhabitants of the Italian peninsula. On European PCA plots, Sardinians are repeatedly the most distinct population, the farthest outlier from the continental cline. Chiang's 2018 paper confirmed this with the most comprehensive Sardinian genome dataset ever assembled. The genetic distance between Sardinians and mainland Italians is enormous, far larger than any other population gap within Italy. Politically, Sardinia is Italian. Genetically, Sardinia is its own thing, a separate data point on the European map, a population that has been running its own evolutionary experiment for 10,000 years. There is a linguistic mirror here, and it's worth looking at because language and genes sometimes travel together. Sardinians do not speak a dialect of Italian. They speak Sardu, a distinct Romance language that evolved directly from Latin. But here's what's fascinating. Sardu is not just another Romance language like French or Spanish or Standard Italian. It is the most conservative Romance language. It preserves features of Latin that every other Romance language has lost. Linguists will tell you that if you want to hear something close to the Latin spoken in the Roman Forum, you go to Sardinia, not to Rome. And beneath that Latin layer, there are traces of something even older. Sardu contains substrate words that likely date back to the pre-Roman Nuragic era, words for plants, for landscape features, for sheep and goats, that seem to come from a language that was spoken on this island before Latin arrived, before the Phoenicians arrived, a language of the Neolithic settlers whose descendants still walk these hills. There is a parallel here with the Basques. The Basques of northern Spain and southern France are the other famous European genetic and linguistic isolate, a population that predates the Indo-European expansion and has held on to a non-Indo-European language into the modern era. Both Sardinia and the Basque Country preserve pre-Indo-European elements, linguistically and genetically. They are living reminders that Europe's deep history is not entirely lost. It's just concentrated in a few stubborn corners. Now I want to go back to the Marcus 2020 paper and the specific moment that gives this video its title. Because when I say that Sardinian DNA is older than every other European's, and that scientists just proved it, I am not speaking loosely. Here is the chain of evidence. Step 1. Chiang 2018 confirms that modern Sardinians are the most genetically distinct European population, with the highest proportion of early European farmer ancestry and the lowest proportion of steppe ancestry. Step 2. Marcus 2020 sequences ancient Sardinians from 41 centuries ago and shows that modern Sardinians are their direct, minimally changed descendants. The overlap on the PCA plot is the visual proof. Step 3. Keller 2012 sequences Ötzi, who lived 53 centuries ago on the mainland, and shows that his closest living relatives are Sardinians, not mainland Europeans. Step 4. Combine these findings. A modern Sardinian carries a genome that is only subtly changed from a Nuragic Sardinian who lived 4,000 years ago. That Nuragic Sardinian, in turn, carried a genome that was essentially the same as a Copper Age mainland European like Ötzi, who lived 5,300 years ago. And that Copper Age genome is the pre-steppe European genome, the genome that was widespread across the continent before the Yamnaya migration overrode it. So what is a modern Sardinian, genetically speaking? A modern Sardinian is a pre-Bronze Age European. A modern Sardinian is what a Frenchman or a German or an Englishman would look like genetically if the steppe migration had never happened. The Sardinian genome is not just old. It is a living fossil, a window into a version of Europe that died everywhere else. Now imagine you are a geneticist named Joseph Marcus, and it's 2020, and you are sitting in your lab looking at this PCA plot. You have the ancient genomes in one color, you have the modern genomes in another, you have overlaid them, and the dots are sitting on top of each other. 4,000 years and the Sardinians haven't moved. 4,000 years of Phoenicians and Romans and Vandals and Byzantines and Pisans and Aragonese and Savoyards, and the genome in the mountain villages has barely twitched. The early anatomically modern humans arrived in Europe maybe 40,000 years ago. The Neolithic farmers arrived maybe 7,000 years ago. The steppe pastoralists arrived maybe 4,500 years ago. Sardinia got the farmers, built the Nuragic, and then closed the door. Not completely. No population is completely isolated, but enough. Enough that the ancestral signal blazes through the noise like a lighthouse beam. Enough that when a geneticist needs a reference population for what pre-Bronze Age Europe looked like, they don't look at a skeleton in a museum. They look at a blood sample from a living Sardinian. The ghost of Ötzi hangs over all of this. That frozen body in the Alps, with his copper axe and his grass cape and his last meal of ibex and einkorn wheat still in his gut. When the hikers found him in 1991, they thought he was a lost mountaineer. The truth was so much stranger. He was a messenger from 5,000 years ago, a man whose genetic kin were supposed to be dead, replaced, ghosted out of the European genome by the thundering hooves of the steppe pastoralists. But the kin weren't dead. They were alive on an island in the middle of the Mediterranean, building stone towers and herding sheep and speaking a language that held onto the sound of Latin and the echo of something even older. And when the scientists put Ötzi's genome into the machine, and the machine compared it to all the living populations of Europe, the answer came back in a language as old as the genetics themselves. Sardinia. Ötzi's people are in Sardinia. They have been there all along. So go back to Giuseppe on his hillside. The ATV is idling, the sheep are drinking. The phone in his pocket buzzes with another message from his daughter in Milan, probably a photo of the Duomo or a complaint about her exams. He is a modern man, connected, contemporary, living in the same century as you. But his genome is older than the Roman Empire, older than the Nuragic towers he can see silhouetted on the next ridge, older, in its fundamental architecture, than the steppe migration that erased his genetic counterparts from the mainland. When Ötzi fell bleeding on that alpine pass, shot in the back with an arrow, his assailant was likely a man whose own ancestors had come from the steppe, bringing the language and the ancestry that would eventually dominate the continent. The victim and the killer represented two worlds colliding. The victim's world, the world of the Neolithic farmers, would disappear from mainland Europe. But on Sardinia, it held on. It holds on still. In the frequency of I2A1A-M26. In the mtDNA of the women in the mountain villages. In the faces of the centenarians in Ogliastra, who tend their gardens and drink their Cannonau wine and live to see great-great-grandchildren, men and women in nearly equal numbers, as if some ancient balance has been preserved along with the ancient genes. And this is the truly vertiginous thing. You are not looking at a museum piece when you look at a Sardinian. You are looking at a continuing, living, evolving population. They are not frozen in amber. They have absorbed some outside DNA. Their language has changed. Their culture has changed. But the core signal, the deep Neolithic ancestry, has persisted with a strength and fidelity that has no parallel in Europe. Every other European population has been stirred and blended and reshaped by the Bronze Age migrations. Sardinia got stirred too, but more gently, more slowly, and the original ingredients are still overwhelmingly present. When you meet a Sardinian, you are meeting a person whose ancestors were living on the same island, speaking a related language, and carrying essentially the same genetic profile, when the Great Pyramid of Giza was still a construction site with decades of work ahead of it. You are meeting a person whose genetic kin were spread across Europe from the Atlantic to the Carpathians, building megaliths and planting wheat, until the steppe riders came. You are meeting a person who carries, in every cell, a version of Europe that the mainland lost 5 millennia ago. Giuseppe finishes checking the water trough. He walks back to the ATV, pats the dog, and takes out his phone again. The sun is higher now, the sea even bluer. The sheep bells a steady rhythm in the clean air. He is thinking about lunch. He is thinking about whether his daughter is eating enough in Milan. He is not thinking about Ötzi, or haplogroups, or the steppe migration, because why would he? He is living his life. But here's what I can't stop thinking about. We spend so much time chasing the future, the next phone, the next city, the next version of ourselves, and then there are people like Giuseppe, people whose very existence collapses the distance between now and a world so ancient, we've turned it into myth. Sardinia is not a metaphor, it's a fact. A fact inscribed in stone and grass and bone and blood. A fact that the scientists can now read like a book written in a language we're only just learning to speak. The oldest genome in Europe isn't in a glacier. It's on an island. It's alive. It's riding an ATV up a hillside to check the water trough. That's the contrast. Then and now. Your DNA and theirs. If this changed how you think about time, subscribe. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Thanks for staying until the very end. Goodbye for now.